I'm so honored and happy to be here today. Brian was talking about Jerry's spirit being with us, and I think that must be the case because I've been thinking for almost 2 months now about what I would say today and what I should say and not say and how to organize it. And then about 45 minutes ago, as I was trying to get ready to come over here, I had a flood of thoughts, and it seemed to me those thoughts that came to me in a flood were much more cogent than anything I had planned to say. So, as Allen Ginsberg liked to quote, I can't use Allen's words or somebody who quote, he says, he was going to speak some words carelessly and he invited his audience to listen carelessly. So I'm speaking in that spirit, and I apologize if this is not as organized and polished a speech as I would normally give. First of all, I'm happy to see so many people here today to remember a man who never sought attention for himself, but who served his community so greatly. As I was listening to Jerry speak in the video we just saw about how he was sad that certain people were not with us any longer, I felt I can join in that sadness, but for a different reason. I'm not only sad that some of those people are not with us today, I am sad that if you walk down the street today and you ask people to name noted gay people, they may mention Elton John, or Barney Frank, or Harvey Milk, or Melissa Etheridge, and on and on. I respect all these people I've just named very much, but knowing their names and not knowing the names of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Activist Alliance, and the key leaders of the homophile movement that became for Stonewall is a little bit like being able to name every president between Grant and Woodrow Wilson in the right order, but not being familiar with names such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, James Monroe, and George Washington. So, yes, you walk down the street and you will ask them to name a famous person in the gay movement for equality, and you will probably never hear Jerry Hoose's name mentioned today. Who was Jerry Hoose? Why should he be remembered? Well, John O'Brien, one of the co-founders of the Gay Liberation Front, pointed out to me that at Stonewall, there was a hierarchy of resistance. Some people merely resisted passively by standing in the streets and not moving when the police asked them to move, so that was the kind of passive support to the demonstrators. Some people, a little braver, yelled. Some others tried to obstruct traffic. And then there were those who actually fought the police. Jerry was one of those who actually fought the police, threw things at them, all for 4 of the 6 nights at Stonewall. He also tried to give it a political direction. He was concerned that nothing would happen, that this would be a flash in the pan that would not be noticed. And he was trying to urge the demonstrators to go protest at City Hall and Gracie Mansion. He co-founded the Gay Liberation Front, helped organize the first openly gay dances in the cities held for gay people. He helped put out the newspaper. He helped organize the first Christopher Street Liberation Day March, which we now know today around the world as Gay Pride marches. And he coined the phrase Gay Pride. So he is a man who very much deserves to be remembered and who has done more for our movement than the names that are more famous. And Jerry, you stole my thunder. I was just going to say the next thing written down, you were talking about your frustration that people don't know what came out of Stonewall. I always say that knowing the history of Stonewall without knowing about the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance, that phase of history we call the Gay Liberation Movement era, it's like knowing about the fall of the Bastille but knowing nothing about the French Revolution. It's important that people begin to know this history in context and to understand how one event and one person and one concept relates to other events, other people, other concepts, other pieces of legislation. And I would say if hundreds of millions of Americans know the name Betsy Ross because she sewed a flag, by God, they should certainly know the name Jerry Hoose not to mention Craig Rodwell, Arthur Evans, Marty Robinson, John O'Brien, Lois Hartz, oh, and a few names that came before them, like Barbara Giddings, Kay Tobin, Harry Hay, Jack Nichols, Randy Wicker, Phyllis Lyon, and Del Martin. Not to know those names, but to know the name of Elton John is kind of like knowing the name Al Sharpton, but not knowing who Martin Luther King is. Knowing those names and not knowing the name of Marty Robinson, Arthur Evans, Craig Rodwell, is kind of like knowing who Betty Friedan was, but not having an idea who the hell Susan B. Anthony was. When Barbara Giddings died, we had to lobby the New York Times about 4 weeks to get them to cover her passing. They said, oh, well, Barbara Giddings was a regional figure. She wasn't important. I think the New York Times should be aware there are these buildings called libraries. And in these buildings, there are things called books. And if they would go look in these books, they would know that Barbara Giddings was not a regional figure. She was one of the founding mothers of an important civil rights movement. People don't realize the courage that it took for those people who came before Stonewall, before the Gay Liberation Front, before the Gay Activist Alliance. I'm currently researching a biography of Frank Kameny, and I heard an anecdote just last week I liked very much. And this was the person who told me this, told me that Frank told it to him. This is about a time when he would go to the Pentagon all by himself and stand up to the officials there and try to get a hearing for somebody who had been denied a security clearance because they were gay. And he said that Frank told him once, well, if you won't let me speak on behalf of my client, there will be blood on the carpet, and it won't be mine. The last time I saw Barbara Giddings was in this building, showing of the film about the gay pickets, and Frank was there. And somebody asked him, Frank, what he thought of the don't ask, don't tell policy. And Frank cited the part of the Constitution that said that anyone who gives support to the enemy is guilty of treason. So he said that on that basis, that he thought Donald Rumsfeld should be impeached, he should be convicted, he should be removed from office, he should be tried for treason, he should be found guilty, and should be hung by the neck until he was dead, and he would supply the rope. Barbara Giddings leaned over to Michael and said, aren't you glad he's on our side? Well, when Ray Castro, the only person we know that we can verify was arrested at the Stonewall Inn, who was alive and locatable, was a gay man, when he died, the New York Times did not cover his death. When Danny Garvin died, I called the New York Times. They would not cover his death. He was one of the most important witnesses at Stonewall. I did not even bother to tell the Times about the death of Jerry. But it is not the fault of these young people today that these lesser-known names are not known by them. When the year 2000 turned, I went to Barnes & Noble. I took a bunch of surveys off the shelf of the last 100 years, the last 1,000 years, and I turned to the index, and I looked up gay, lesbian, homosexual. Most of those books didn't include us, and if we were included, it was a very brief mention. You know, maybe all gay history can be summed up in 2 or 3 paragraphs, and if you know about Harvey Milk and the Mattachine Society and AIDS happened, then you sort of know all there is to it. You don't get the kind of full treatment that the Black Civil Rights Movement or the feminist movement gets. I have often said that the gay history, if you want to use the metaphor of our civil rights movement as a museum, we're never an exhibition on the main hallway. It's always, there's this little alcove at the end on the left you might want to stick your nose in. But that's beginning to change. The Library of Congress has acquired the papers of Frank Kameny and now Lily Vincennes. The film Milk was well noted. President Obama used the phrase from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall in his inaugural speech. And there's now a movement to make the Stonewall site a national monument or a national park. when the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage rights, that overturned DOMA, and Edie Windsor began to have the status that used to be granted to Rosa Parks. That was a significant moment. HBO is planning a series about gay teenagers in New York with the Stonewall as a backdrop. And perhaps in June, we will get good news from the U.S. Supreme Court, and perhaps same-sex marriage will be declared a constitutional right. If this happens, I think our history will begin to be recognized as important and legitimate. This needs to happen because when I was brought up, I had the understanding that children needed to understand what was happening in the world. They needed to understand issues, to be good citizens, to participate in a democracy as good citizens. In Jessup, Georgia, I grew up in a small town. Only 5 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, I was taught about Brown versus the Board of Education and Plessy v. Ferguson and the Dred Scott decision. I say that it is now many years since the Lawrence v. Texas decision, and it is many years since the APA declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. Our story needs to be integrated into the great civics lessons that our children are taught, whether that be through documentary films on PBS and BBC, it be in textbooks. This needs to become a demand of our movement. It's just as we ask for the right to marriage, and we want to have finally, we don't have this yet, folks, a federal civil rights law that says you can't be fired from a job or denied credit because you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. It also needs to be a demand of our movement that our history be included in the national tapestry. And if we do not ask the people, if we do not know our history ourselves, how will we know who we are? A sense of identity usually comes from having a common narrative and knowing that story. Whether you're a Jew and you want to know the history of Moses coming out of Egypt, leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, or you're a black person and you want to know the history of Sojourner Truth and the Underground Railroad, it is knowing a history that defines us in our own minds and gives us dignity. It is also true in the words of Santayana that those who don't know the facts are bound to repeat the past. There was a strong gay rights movement in Germany that was wiped out by Hitler. When the Communist Revolution happened in Russia, it initially saw homosexual liberation as part of the communist vision. This was turned over by Stalin. We saw how our movement here could be set by people like Anita Bryant, John Briggs, by Ronald Reagan ignoring us during the AIDS crisis. It is important that our history be known not merely for reasons of dignity, but for our own preservation and to protect the gains that we have won so hard over many decades. Now back to Jerry a bit. Jerry told me that when he heard about the Stonewall, it was him and his friend John Goodman who was mentioned. He called him up and he said, "Miss Hoose, get on the train and get into the city quick. You will not believe what's going on." She told me they had raided the Stonewall and there was a crowd outside and everybody was going nuts. Jerry's testimony was very important because it had been very contested, who were the main actors and so forth. And I had Tommy Lanning Schmidt, who was one of the street youth, and Bob Kohler telling me that it was mainly these homeless gay street youth who were mainly effeminate gay men and been, disowned by their families and so forth. So when Jerry told me that John Goodman called me, said he got there, and he said it had gotten started by a bunch of people. All the other queens had, like Zazu Nova, Queen of Sex, that was a black transgender person, Marsha P. Johnson, but it was led most of all, the first one was Jackie Harmona. who was one of the gay street youth. And this was critical corroboration because there's only one photograph from the first night of the Stonewall riots. That photograph had been overlooked and not generally interpreted because it was very fuzzy. So when it was cleaned up by a computer, I recognized that a young man I'd seen a number of photographs, and from the descriptions I suspected that was Jackie Harmona. So I showed it to the photograph to Bob Kohler. I said, "Do you know this person?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Who are they?" He said, "That's Jackie Harmona." And that photograph happened to be taken just at about the moment the crowd was beginning to try to keep the police from being able to take their prisoners. Jerry had a great recollection of the kick line. He said, "We were looking, and I remember saying to each other, 'They're going to kill them. They're dead. They're dead meat. Fabulous. Keep going, girls. Keep going, girls.' But I thought they were dead." Jerry was clear that the reaction that he felt and others was extreme anger. He said, "We're not going to stand for this anymore. It was crazies and gay people, not really conservative gay people. It was the crazy ones. It was all the kids who hung out in Sheridan Square Park, homeless kids who couldn't even get into the Stonewall Inn." Jerry's greatest fear was that he was so happy during the riots because he felt finally we're standing up for ourselves, we're doing something. But he was afraid it would be ignored. And he thought when it was all over that, well, maybe at least they won't come down and arrest us so often. Maybe we've accomplished that. And then he met Michael Brown, who approached him and handed him a pamphlet asking him to come to a meeting, which turned out to be the founding of the Gay Liberation Front, which Jerry threw himself into heart and soul. He also worked with Craig Rodwell to organize the first march. And working on that, he thinks he's the one who came up. He said, "I said one day we should say gay pride," when they were working on organizing the first march for June 28, 1970. And so apparently this phraseology comes from him. I have said that, I felt so much loss recently because Marl Becker, who ran Out FM, died. He was a very key activist in GAA. Danny Garvin died in December, and now January and February, Jerry died. And it's, it's a time where one gets the feeling of history passing, so it's very important that we do all we can to remember these people and to get the history recognized. And so I remember when Danny died, I said that of all the people I met and interviewed working on the book, Danny was the sweetest. And I came to me this morning that if Danny was the sweetest, Danny Garvin, certainly Jerry Hoose was the campiest and the funniest. And he didn't even have to try. I got a real laugh going through these transcripts last night because he was talking about all these people in drag in the kick line and fighting the cops, and then he showed me one of the pictures of Fred McDowell, pictures of these people, and I said, well, he said they're all in drag like that, and I said, well, Jerry, they're all wearing men's clothing, they're not wearing women's clothing. And he said, oh, honey, these people didn't have to wear women's clothing to be in drag. Okay. I'm sorry I'm going on too long here. Anyhow, I like to say I'd like to do something else now in Jerry's memory that to call for that need for the history, for our history to be recognized. When the U.S. Post Office began to put out stamps, you put your own cell phone. Kay Tobin would send me a letter with her and Barbara's picture on the stamp. And I was thinking this morning, you know, if Walt Disney, she shouldn't have put her own picture on the stamp. If Walt Disney and Elvis Presley were on postage stamps, we should have Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin and Del Martin, Phyllis Lyon, and Frank Kameny. People like that. They should be on our postage stamps and on our dollar bills. There should be statues of them. There should be cities named after them, high schools named after them. So I have two proposals. One is that maybe we could work with people who do Out History Month and ask that the first day of that month maybe could be named Jerry Hoose Action Day. Ask people around the country, go to your library, go to your local high school, go to your local junior high. Ask them to show you a book that includes gay history with the same treatment that the Black Civil Rights Movement or the women's suffragist movement gets. The last thing I'd like to do is to make this a little bit of a political funeral. Tom started out with a chant, so I'd like to do, I'm taking this from Lillian Biederman's just written a book, it's not published yet. I know one of her working titles, she worked with Kay Tobin on it, tell me it's called It's Our History Too. So I'm going to say 4 words, and I want you to answer with our history. Whose U.S. history is it?
Our history.
Whose civil rights history is it?
Our history.
Whose human rights history is it?
Our history.
And whose world history is it?
Our history.
We should demand full inclusion now. And Jerry, you helped us get to Never Never Land. Thank you. So the film we're going to see is a brief historic overview of the 1969 period, and it will include Jerry Hoose and Martin Boyce, and who will talk about people being arrested and beaten, as well as the famous kick line. Thank you.